Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome, and thank you all very much for joining us for the Universities UK Research and Culture Forum webinar. Now, this is hosted in partnership with the Researcher Development, the Research Integrity, and the Knowledge Exchange Concordats, and the Technicians Commitment Initiative. I want to start by saying a word of thanks to our colleagues from UUK, Tom Rowe, Dan Wake, and Oliver Burnham, for all the fantastic work they've done to organise this meeting, and also to colleagues from the three Concordats and the Technicians Commitment who've come together to develop the programme for what I'm sure will be 2 days of really good discussion about research, culture and practice. And I'm really delighted to say that we've got over 650 people registered for these 2 days. I think that's absolutely fantastic, and I hope as many of you as possible are going to participate in the discussions. My name is Julia Buckingham, and I'm going to be chairing this session. By way of introduction, I chair the Researcher Development Concordat Strategy Group, which is a bit of a mouthful. I'm joined for this session by Dr. Kelly Veer from the University of Nottingham, Dr. Kat Ball from the Scottish Funding Council, and Professor Karin Well-Jorgensen from Cardiff University. Now, just before we start, a few housekeeping points. We're very, very keen to encourage questions from the audience and discussion. Now, to make this work, please use the Q&A function throughout to ask your questions to the speakers, not the chat. If you put it in the chat, we as speakers won't be able to see your questions. But you can, of course, use the chat to add your own views and insights and suggestions about the topics that we're discussing today with the other attendees. But as I said, please don't use the chat for questions, please use the Q&A. And it would be really helpful if you could start sending your questions while the speakers are giving their introductory remarks, rather than waiting to the end, so that we can make sure we don't lose any of that valuable discussion time. The webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded onto the UUK Events YouTube page, and you should get an email from UUK once it's all available to view. Now, turning then to the topic of the forum, research culture and practice. And research culture has really risen to the fore and become embedded in our discourse over the past few years. From government departments, first BEIS, now its successor SDIT, to UKRI and other major funders, to institutions, their governing bodies and senior teams, and most importantly, to all the many staff and students who are directly or indirectly involved in research. Research culture matters to all of us, and of course it's a critical element of delivery of high quality research, which of course is our ultimate goal. Now, research culture is easy to say, but how do we define and deliver a good research culture? Do we have a common understanding of what we mean? And how best can we go about supporting and learning from each other to foster positive cultures? For me, and I'm speaking personally, research culture has many facets, but principally it's about people and creating an environment in which everybody, whatever their role in the research ecosystem, has the opportunity to thrive and play their part in delivering that high quality research, and where possible, translating it to bring social, cultural and economic benefit. I think the key elements include respect for everybody, whatever their role and their individual characteristics. As my grandmother used to say, always treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. Highest standards of research conduct, a strong ethical framework, good practice in the design and execution of studies, the management, storage and publication of data, and all the other things that come under the umbrella of research integrity, excuse me, including, and very importantly, appropriate recognition of the contribution of all members of the team, and of course, embracing collaboration, creativity, and innovation. Open-mindedness in discussion in the presentation of new and different ideas and views. We must be able to debate and challenge each other, to offer alternative interpretation and ideas without feeling threatened. To quote the former Vice-Chancellor of Oxford, we must all learn to disagree well. Equality of opportunity for everybody, irrespective of their background, and fairness of employment. We're going to be talking about careers tomorrow, but making sure that individuals are supported in their professional development, whatever their role, and offered good career advice, recognizing that there are many potential avenues for researchers, both within and beyond academia. Celebrating success and managing difficulties effectively and transparently as they arise, and of course, much, much more. So whose responsibility is it to ensure a strong research culture? My answer is all of us. Everyone in the research ecosystem has a part to play, whatever their role. It's not somebody else's problem or somebody else's job. There may be somebody conducting the orchestra, but as we all know, great performance depends on all players playing their part and working as a team. The violins are not more important than the woodwind. The soloist playing the concerto will only give a great performance if he or she is in harmony with the orchestra and vice versa. So with those initial thoughts, I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Kelly Veer. Kelly is the Director of Technical Strategy at the University of Nottingham, and alongside that, she founded and she leads the Technician Commitment, which is a sector-wide initiative to ensure visibility, recognition, career development, and sustainability for the technical community. It's a very, very important initiative for which she was very rightly awarded an MBE. So, Kelly, over to you to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here. So firstly, who am I? As Julia mentioned, my name is Kelly Veer. I have roles at the University of Nottingham and the Science Council. At the University of Nottingham, I'm the Director of Technical Strategy, which means I look after the strategic direction of our 700-strong technical community across the university. And for 9 years now, I've had a part-time external secondment to the Science Council. And through that, I lead and developed an initiative called the Technician Commitment, which I'm going to say a little bit more about. As panelists today, we've been asked to provide some reflections on research culture over the last few years, and I'm taking a personal perspective on an area that unsurprisingly means an awful lot to me, and that's increasing recognition and inclusion of all roles in the ecosystem. So my journey, I'm just going to try and flick these slides on. For some reason they're not going. Hopefully that's working for you. My journey began in 1999 when I joined the University of Nottingham as a junior medical technician at the age of 18. I didn't know technical careers existed. I completely fell into this role by accident. As a naive 18-year-old, I thought universities were full of professors and students, and was completely naive to all the amazing careers that you can have, and the amazing roles that really drive forward the research endeavour. So I fell into this role and I absolutely loved it. And it quickly became very apparent to me that the technical team and technical skills and careers were absolutely essential to higher education and research. But unfortunately, the culture wasn't always that positive. In many ways, it was kind of a little bit like Downton Abbey. As technicians, we were almost hidden below deck, if you like, with our academic and researcher colleagues, I guess, given the limelight. And certainly when I looked beyond, the university and across the sector as a whole, that was the sort of pattern that I began to see. And so this made me really question things, really, because of course, as Julia was just mentioned, we can't do research without a whole ecosystem of people with incredibly diverse roles. We're all absolutely essential to solving global challenges. And technicians are an absolutely vital part of that ecosystem. Yet traditionally, as a community, we've experienced a lack of visibility and recognition. And as a consequence, actually, this is pretty alarming because the UK has an identified shortage of technical skills and roles. We are also ageing as a community, and there's significant EDI challenges that we face too. And if not addressed, this is a real threat to achieving, government ambitions around science superpower, innovation nation, and the desired increased investment in GDP. So as a technician, I've been working with colleagues and sector organisations for some time now to try to bring about a change in culture in the way we think about technical skills, roles and careers. And that's been predominantly through an initiative called the Technician Commitment, and also through the Research England funded talent programme. And both initiatives, which we're going to hear more about over the course of the next 2 days, are genuinely making real progress to ensure that technical careers are respected and valued. And the Technician Commitment alone has actually unlocked investment both inwardly and externally in the region of several £1 million into, development of the technical community, which we're delighted about. And I guess for me, what I wanted to talk about today was, this key development in recent years being that greater recognition and inclusion of so many roles, not just technicians that enable, the UK's world-class research. We've got so many more groups in the ecosystem now really taking, and forming a strong professional identity and shouting loud and proud about their profession and the contributions they make to research and innovation in this country. We're also seeing that through our funders, and I thought I'd just use this example. UKRI recently ran a campaign which is still live called 101 Jobs That Change the World. We would never have seen, a major funder in this way profile the work of technicians just 10 years ago. And actually, even to be invited to be speaking at this forum today, actually, and representing the technical community is a huge step forward in terms of, progress in recent years. And so just to close, I guess, whilst it's so important that, our roles, of all the research enablers, if you like, are being increasingly recognised, it's so important that we also drive to ensure parity of esteem for those roles, that people aspire to those roles, and I guess opportunities to encourage porosity and not focus so much around, your job title or the box you sit in, and to really open up opportunities for all parts of the ecosystem. So I guess I'll just finish by saying, there really has been so much progress in recent years, but absolutely there is so much more to do. And there's so much more we can do by working together to ensure an even more vibrant and impactful research culture in the future. I'll close there. Thanks, Julia.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Kelly. That was a great introduction to the fantastic work you've done on the technicians' commitment and the whole issue of technicians' careers, which, as we all know, are very, very important and a really essential part of the ecosystem if we're going to do good research. And I'm sure colleagues are thinking of lots of questions that you'd like to ask Kelly about the work she's done. Now, moving onwards, our next speaker is Dr. Kat Ball. Kat is Assistant Director of Research and Innovation at the Scottish Funding Council, where, among other things, she's done a very interesting and important piece of work on supporting research collaborations and making connections between different disciplines, sectors, and places. So, Kat, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you for that introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here today helping to kick off the Research Culture and Practice Forum. Before I dive in, I'll just say a little bit about who the Scottish Funding Council are, because I'm going to be giving you a bit of an institutional funder perspective on research culture in my remarks this morning. So SFC, as you might be aware, is Scotland's tertiary education and research funding authority. So we provide funding for learning, for teaching, for skills, for research and knowledge exchange in universities and colleges in Scotland. And we do that on behalf of the Scottish Government. So if I just switch to the next slide, awesome. So for research, one of our priorities as set out in our new strategic plan, which was published last year, one of our priorities is to promote a supportive research culture for talented people and teams. And in terms of how we do that, if we just switch to my next slide, we do that through a variety of different ways, and I'm sure some of these things will come up in the course of the discussions today and tomorrow, but I'll just give you a quick canter through some of SFC's work in this space. So our outcome agreements have a role here, and for those of you not aware, outcome agreements are what they say. They are agreements between SFC and institutions, which essentially set out what institutions are going to do in return effectively for SFC's funding. And we're now requesting a research culture statement as part of that process. And they also set out our expectations for institutions in terms of alignment with both the Researcher Development Concordat and the Research Integrity Concordat. And that's part of our actions as a signatory to both of those concordats. In terms of work more broadly, we have a partnership with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, and the most recent output from that was published earlier this year, a report and action plan called Tackling Persistent Inequalities Together, and we continue to do a lot of work there. We're an active member of the Forum for Tackling Bullying and Harassment, and we also try to ensure sector engagement and consultation throughout our work in this space, because that's obviously incredibly important. One of the ways we do that is we have established a new advisory group on supporting Scotland's postgraduate researchers. And we're also regular contributors to the University Scotland Researcher Development and Culture Committee. Many of you will be aware of that committee, many of you are possibly members of that committee, but it brings together researcher developers and culture practitioners across universities in Scotland, and it's a really great and effective group. So I shift to the next slide. I still feel a bit like Chris Whitty when I say that next slide thing. It feels like kind of like a distant memory now. I mentioned SFC's outcome agreements. So we asked for a research culture statement for the first time as part of last year's process. And although what we received was very much informed by the structure of the ask, the structure of the process, and the ask on research culture was optional, so not every institution returned something. What we got back does enable us to understand a little bit of a perspective of what research culture looks like at a national level in Scotland. So from these returns, we can see that there are essentially 4 different categories that universities in Scotland fit into in terms of their engagement with research culture issues. So we could say that they are either maturing their focus, developing their focus, just starting out, or an area or an institution where we don't have any information, so they just didn't return. And we're really keen to support institutions at each stage in that process as a national funder. And I think overall, it's fair to say that culture as a whole is growing, but it's still at a kind of developmental stage really for institutions in Scotland. And what might be particularly interesting for this group is that a lot of the returns we received about culture were presented and framed in terms of the concordats, particularly the Researcher Development Concordat and the Research Integrity Concordat, which I think speaks to the real value and importance of these initiatives in shaping research culture in our institutions. So if I just go to my next slide. So finally, I just wanted to highlight that there is really strong appetite across Scottish universities for national collaboration on research culture. And Scotland does have quite a rich history of university collaboration in research in a variety of different ways, and I've listed some of the initiatives that promote that collaboration on this slide. And particularly in the research culture space, I mentioned the University Scotland RDCC committee, but we also have the Scott Herd group. And these provide really valuable spaces for shared thinking around research culture across every Scottish university, really bringing together practitioners, people who are working at the coalface in order to kind of swap ideas and share understanding of what's happening. And SFC is really supportive of this approach, and we are considering ways that we can support it further. So it's really great to be part of these discussions over the next couple of days, and we're looking forward to working together across universities in Scotland. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Kat. That was a fantastic presentation. And it's really good to hear that universities are wanting to collaborate on this, because I think it's just so important that we all work together and try and improve the culture rather than start getting competitive against it, because this isn't something we should be, in my view, we should be competing with one another to try and deliver. So thank you, Kat, that was great. Let's move swiftly on to our last speaker, Karen Wall-Jorgensen. Now, Karen is the Dean of Research and Environment and Culture at Cardiff University. She's had a very distinguished career as a researcher, and she currently directs the Research Centre for Community Journalism. And she undertakes this role alongside her role as Dean of Research, Environment and Culture, where she's very focused on enhancing an inclusive, collaborative and creative research environment across the university. So Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Boyda. It is great to see this event and great to see attention being called to these issues. So as Julia just said, I'm University Dean of Research, Environment and Culture at Cardiff University. And so I'm working on enhancing research culture within my institution, but I'm also actually working very closely with HEFQ on research culture related issues. And so this morning I'm talking a little bit about both of these topics, wearing both of these hats. So first of all, I want to briefly touch on a sort of distinctive Welsh context, and then tell you a little bit about what's going on around research culture in Wales and at Cardiff. So in Wales, higher education is an area of devolved decision-making. And what that means is that we are affected by both decisions made by the Conservative government in Westminster and also by the Labour minority Welsh government in Cardiff Bay. What I think is quite unique across the devolved nations is that in Wales, we're operating in a bilingual context, which means that we have a built-in recognition of the importance of the Welsh language and also lots of translation work to do all the time. In terms of funding, higher education institutions in Wales are funded by HEFQ. And so similar to Scotland, in Wales, we're not benefiting from dedicated research culture funding up until now, in the same way that English institutions have through Research England funding. However, HEFQ has the intention to identify such funding. It's also worth noting that from April 2024, HEFQ will be rolled into the new Commission for Tertiary Education and Research, CETA, and that is a way in Wales to join up further education and higher education, but also obviously something which has policy-related implications going forward. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Welsh higher education sector, and I've actually borrowed this slide from HEFQ, so thanks to HEFQ for letting me use it. So we have a total of 9 universities in Wales, if we include the Open University, which operates across the UK. And what I think is quite interesting about the Welsh context is that we're looking at extremely diverse institutions in terms of their sizes, shapes, and orientations. So Welsh institutions include smaller specialist ones like the Welsh College of Music and Drama. We also have several research-intensive universities, as well as more teaching-focused institutions. So when we take all of these institutions together, this very diverse sector actually represents a very substantial contribution to both the economy and the culture in Wales, accounting for 1 in every 20 jobs in Wales. But it's also worth noting that the diversity of institutions and actually also the kind of beautiful but challenging geography of Wales, that these factors create challenges in terms of generating collaboration. But similar to what Kat just reported in Scotland, what we're seeing is that debates around research culture actually provide a really great opportunity to engage in particular areas. So, for example, while to my knowledge, there are only sort of dedicated research culture leads at Cardiff and Swansea, there's actually extensive work and extensive resources being invested in topics relating to research culture across Welsh institutions, including questions around research integrity and ethics, equality, diversity, and inclusion, as well as openness and transparency of research. So just to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we're doing at Cardiff University. At Cardiff, we've made research culture a very significant institutional priority. We've had a Dean of Research Environment and Culture, the job that I now hold since 2019. And in 2021, our University Executive Board approved a proposal for transforming research culture. That work is premised on the idea that a positive research culture is not just good for everyone making a contribution to research, but is actually a precondition for excellent research to happen. So our plans for transforming research culture cover the breadth of activities in the institution. So that ranges from strategy and governance to policies and procedures, training and support, and visibility, recognition, and reward. But we do have specific areas of priority in our action plan. And these areas of priority reflect both central debates that you see across the sector relating to research culture, but also the views of our research culture, research community. So what we've just done quite recently is to carry out our first institutional research culture survey, which is sort of inspired by similar exercises done elsewhere, including Newcastle, Glasgow, and St. Andrews. And we've done this in part to get a sense of what's actually happening on the ground, but also to enable the priorities of our research culture action plan to be informed by the findings. At the same time, the work that we're doing like at other institutions, is underpinned by our commitment to charters, concordats, and agreements. And obviously, these ensure institutional support and buy-in, but they obviously also require us to monitor and to report on our progress. And I just thought I would throw that in there because this is so essential to the discussion that we're having over these 2 days. So with that in mind, I wanted to share a few reflections on what I see as some next big steps coming up in terms of work on research culture across the sector. So the first thing to note is that while we don't yet know the details of the next REF, there is a clear sense that research culture is likely to become an increasingly important component. And that obviously represents a significant incentive to get supportive structures in place and to deepen collaboration on these issues. I also wanted to comment a little bit on the future considerations around concordats and agreements. From a kind of institutional perspective, I think it's important to consider the tension between a compliance-led and value-driven approach, which is kind of built into processes surrounding these charters and agreements. As several investigations and inquiries on these have found, there is a particular urgency around reducing the bureaucratic burden associated with signing up to change, also to level the playing field and to kind of allow less resource-rich institutions as well as smaller institutions to take part. And then I also just finally wanted to mention that the issue of job security and career progression remains a really key one. That's something that was very clearly shown in our research culture survey findings. And that's a very complex and wicked issue to sort out. It's one that requires collaboration between funders, policymakers, and institutions. And so I just wanted to note the importance of remaining focused on these kinds of structural issues in our work to enhance research cultures. Thank you all very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you very much indeed, Karen. That was great. And I think your last point about supporting the career development of researchers, it's so key, and it's just such a problem we've had for such a long time. And we seem still not to be making, in my view, the progress that we ought to be making. But we have got, I think, 3 sessions on that area tomorrow. So I hope we'll get lots and lots of discussion and perhaps some ideas as to how we can do things better. But thank you, Karen, and thank you to all the speakers. It's time now for the audience to challenge us with some questions. So I think we've got Tom from UUK who's going to orchestrate the questions for us, and then we'll see who can answer what. So Tom, over to you.
Thanks, Julia. We've got a specific question for Kat in the Q&A about how SFC thought of what it does with the research culture outcome agreements and how these are monitored. For example, if an institution doesn't return one. Kat, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tom. And it's a great question. So as I flagged in my presentation, we have asked for research culture statements for 1 year only so far. So we asked for the first time last year. And as I said, that request was optional because it was something new that we were adding into the process. We have revised and included a research culture statement request in this year's statements. And really the function of that is twofold. So it's first of all about promoting understanding for us at SFC about what the national picture looks like, and therefore about how we can best support the environment and positive research cultures in Scotland. But it's also intended, and we heard from institutions that this is something that's valuable. It's also intended to help elevate research culture internally. So, by SFC asking about this in the outcome agreement process, it means that those conversations are happening in certain spaces, and we hope that that is kind of a supportive and helpful thing. So really, at the moment, it's not so much about, a stick if things aren't being done. It's more about a carrot in supporting culture to be considered and discussed as something important. But we are developing our outcome agreement process and putting new frameworks in place. So it's all kind of being considered for the round when the new processes happen, which will be in 24-25.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Kat. Tom, next question.
Thanks, Julia. We have one, I think, about incentives and how to sort of change the culture relies on sort of changing what's being rewarded. And I think there's something about burden on some institutions with personal impact statements. So I guess any reflections on, I think, how to incentivize with, I guess, a positive rather than a deficit rule, I think is the question.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Perhaps Karen, you'd like to have a go at that one from an institutional perspective, and then a hand over to Kelly to talk about it from a technician's perspective. Karen, do you want to have a go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would say in terms of thinking about incentives to promote a positive research culture, I think that at an institutional perspective, these have to be built into reward and recognition mechanisms. So, for example, our promotions criteria as institutions should reflect a commitment to positive research culture and to our priorities. It's something that we have to take into consideration when we think about hiring processes as well. And it's something that we need to build into our strategic plans. But what I also want to note is that you can't make these changes in isolation as an individual institutions. They have to be premised on a broader shift across the sector, and also in terms of funder policy as well as government policy. So yes, you can make changes as an institution, but things are only really going to shift if we kind of move forward together.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, Karen, because I think so often we hear that a team leader would like to promote someone within the team, but they are held back because there simply aren't the funds in the grant to enable that to happen. And I think it's a really important discussion for us as a sector to be having with funders to make sure that people in those roles can be successfully promoted. And I guess there's something also about making sure that all our PIs are properly trained in appraisals and developing their staff. And I'm sure there are areas where it's done brilliantly. I equally suspect that there are some areas where it's not quite as good as it might be, and we've probably got a bit of work to do in those areas. But Kelly, tell us a little bit about it from the technician's perspective.
Sure. So I guess in terms of changing culture, I think what's worked really well with the technical community is that community of practice that's been built behind the technician commitment. So yes, I'm just thinking about the question that was posed. I guess the burden of changing the culture did fall on technicians initially to drive that forward from a grassroots perspective. But then the influence that we could have on a number of different stakeholders, for example, government, policymakers, funders, universities as employers has really grown and strengthened because of that sort of community of practice that's driven that. So I think it is possible, and we are seeing, different reward and recognition schemes come into play since, the inception of that initiative. So, for example, there's been some fantastic work at the University of Liverpool who've developed, a promotional pathway for research technical professionals, which is really groundbreaking, fantastic. We've seen Newcastle appoint their first professor of practice who's a technician, that's a technical role. So we're starting to see different, innovative ways of reward and recognition come from what was initially a very grassroots driven initiative.
Great, thank you very much, Kelly. That was very, very interesting. Tom.
Yeah, thanks. We have a couple of questions, I think, that are kind of touching on the point of collaboration across the sector. And I think the question is, how can we avoid institutional competition, especially given that there is a sort of funding attached to, enhancing research culture?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question, because I think we still instinctively all tend to compete with one another. But I think there is a lot more drive from government and from funders to encourage us to work collaboratively. And I think that in itself is a very, very important message. But I think it's up to all of us. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. This is everybody's problem, not one person's problem. And it's really up to all of us to make sure that we are working together and we don't set up a competitive framework. I don't think anyone's going to set up a competitive framework for us, but it's up to us to make sure that it doesn't sort of seep in to the way in which we're working. But let's see what my colleagues think about that. Kat, maybe let's start with you as a funder.
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So, I mean, it's a really great point about the sort of tension between collaboration and competition and how that plays out here. What I would say is that, in SFC's kind of extensive engagement, talking with sector representatives at a variety of different levels. So from vice principals for research to, researcher developers, researchers themselves, culture practitioners, there seems to be a real genuine enthusiasm to work together and to share resources, recognition in the Scottish sector that there is a variety of different sizes of institutions. We have some very large research intensives. We've got some teaching focused universities who are increasingly working on research, some small specialist institutions, and actually there appears to us to be this real willingness to share resources, to understand best practice, to work collaboratively. So we aren't seeing so much that competitive element here. It does appear to be really actually quite collaborative and quite focused on that kind of space.
Great, thank you, Kat. Let's go to Kelly next.
I guess from my experience, Julia, I mean, just going back to the technician commitment, that is a tool to, I guess, really affect culture change, isn't it? It's a research culture tool, if you like. We co-designed how we were going to assess progress and impact of that tool with the very community that sort of initiated it, those very first, adopters. And it was really interesting. They came back to us very strongly saying they didn't want, a bronze, silver, gold for this. They didn't want it to be tiered in that regard, because it was a culture change activity, of course. But actually, the technician commitment community, the collaboration is absolutely key. It's fantastic. We actively encourage the sharing of best practice. There's individual networks that are formed regionally, and organically, which has been wonderful. It's definitely not been an area of competition. I'd say, if anything, the links between institutions have been strengthened, not weakened, because of that culture change tool.
Great, thank you, Kelly. That's very encouraging to hear. Karen.
Well, I was just going to say that I think it's true that competition is inevitable. At the same time, I agree with the other speakers that collaboration is essential for making changes to research culture. It's essential to get good ideas, examples of good practice, inspiration from colleagues elsewhere. And I also think that ideas around collaboration are actually really essential to the whole ethos of research culture. So in that sense, for me, it represents a real opportunity to deepen collaboration, even if at the same time we have to acknowledge that collaboration does coexist with continued competition between institutions. I think that's probably inevitable.
Great, thank you, Karen. Okay, I think we've got time for one more quick question.
Yeah, so this is a question for Karen, and it touches on the tension between compliance-led and value-driven approaches. And do you have any sort of views or experiences on how this can be balanced successfully?
I think it's a real challenge, isn't it? Because on the one hand, when we have a push towards compliance, it does lead us towards more robust processes and monitoring, so that whatever we're doing is not just about words, but actually about action. But at the same time, true culture change cannot happen without actually people on the ground believing that this is all a good idea. So I think it's actually essential to get the researcher community involved with this work. It's essential that it is a grassroots initiative, and that it's driven by a recognition that this is actually a really positive set of developments that are going to lead to the recognition of contributions of everyone involved in research.
Okay, great. Thank you very much indeed, Karen. That was a lovely ending. And I think very sadly, we are going to have to draw this to a close. I think we could go on talking for a lot longer, but we've got lots of opportunity to do that over the next couple of days. So a big thank you to my speakers and to all the delegates who've contributed to the discussion. I think we've had a great discussion, and it set the scene very well for the programme over the next couple of days. So I hope you all enjoy it, and please do continue to contribute to the discussions and put forward your thoughts and ideas, because I think it's only by hearing about what you think and all the rest of it that we can really work together across the sector to try and drive the research culture that I think we all want. So thank you all very much, and we're going to close this now so that you can move into the next session on time.